A wounded German shepherd appeared at the door of a small town classroom, his fur soaked, his eyes full of pain. But when the teacher reached down, she saw a note tied to his collar. Help him. What happened next revealed a bond that defied war, memory, and even death. Who was this dog? And why did a silent little boy in the back of the class suddenly start to cry? Drop a comment if you believe some souls never forget kindness. Don't forget to subscribe.
The morning air in Mountain Hollow, a snow-dusted town nestled along the pine-covered ridges of northern Montana, was bitter and still. It was late November, and fresh snow had fallen overnight, leaving the streets glazed and silent, muffling the usual rustle of morning traffic and footsteps. The sky remained heavy with clouds, casting a dim silver hue over the small town like a worn wool blanket. Cold wind whispered through the narrow alleys, weaving its way to the windows of Willow Creek Elementary, a modest brick building whose red walls peeked through the white veil like a relic of warmth in a frozen world. Inside room 3B, warmth radiated from the old furnace vents, and children's chatter buzzed gently against the walls lined with cut-out paper leaves and early Christmas drawings. At the front of the class stood Grace Ellison, a 38-year-old elementary school teacher with a tall, slender frame and a presence both calm and commanding. Her auburn hair was always tied in a low bun, a streak of gray visible near her right temple, a mark of years carried not just in age, but experience. Her eyes were a soft hazel, tired but kind, the kind that lingered a moment longer on each child's face as if memorizing the shape of their pain or joy. Grace had moved to Mountain Hollow 7 years ago after a painful divorce in Billings, retreating from a life filled with noise and loss. The town welcomed her in the quiet way only small towns could, with little fuss and much room to breathe. Over time, she'd become a cornerstone of the community, steady, intuitive, and deeply devoted to her students. Today, her voice moved gently through a reading lesson when something outside disrupted the stillness. A strange sound, not wind, not footsteps, scratched against the classroom's front door. A soft, rhythmic scrape, then a pause. Then again, she stopped mid-sentence, eyes narrowing toward the door. The students, sensing the sudden shift in tone, turned their heads in unison. Some whispered, others stilled completely. Grace placed her book on the podium. "Stay seated," she said calmly, and moved toward the door. The scratch came again, slower, heavier, as if from something with claws. She opened it. The wind rushed in first, sharp and cold, but what made the room go silent was not the weather. Standing on the icy stone step was a German shepherd, emaciated and trembling, its fur matted with slush and old blood. One of its ears was torn near the tip, and its left hind leg hovered just above the ground, clearly injured. Despite the misery etched into every inch of its body, it didn't whimper or growl. Its eyes, a deep, intelligent amber, stared directly at Grace. Tied loosely around its neck was a weathered string. Hanging from it was a piece of lined notebook paper, soaked and crumpled, but legible. In shaky pencil, it read, "Help him." Gasps rose from the classroom. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Behind the shepherd, the snow swirled in soft spirals, but the animal didn't flinch. It took one faltering step forward, then collapsed onto its front legs with a low thud. Grace knelt immediately, not thinking, just moving. Her scarf dropped to the floor as she reached for the dog, hand steady, voice low. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now." In the classroom, a boy rose from the third desk in the front row. His name was Ben Whitaker, 9 years old, pale with shaggy brown hair that fell just past his ears. He was small for his age and mostly silent, rarely spoke unless spoken to. Ben lived with his grandparents at the edge of town, ever since a gas explosion had taken his parents the previous winter. He hadn't cried at school. He hadn't spoken much at all. But now, Ben walked quietly to the doorway, eyes locked on the wounded shepherd. He knelt next to Grace without saying a word. His small hand reached out, rested gently on the dog's damp shoulder. The animal lifted its head weakly and looked straight at him. That was when Grace saw it, something passing between the two. Not fear, not curiosity, recognition, as if two wounds had brushed against each other and acknowledged they shared the same shape. Grace glanced at Ben. Do you know dogs well? Ben nodded once. Used to. We had one. Her name was Maple. She slept at my feet every night. He paused. Till the fire? Grace didn't press. She stood and gently called to her classroom aide over the intercom to cover the class. Then she returned with an old red flannel blanket from the lost and found bin, wrapped the dog with practiced hands, and told Ben, "We need to call Dr. Granger." Lucas Granger, the town's only veterinarian, arrived 10 minutes later in a dented blue pickup truck with his vet bag in the back seat. Lucas was in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered with a gentle manner and the look of someone who had grown up among barns and birch trees. His dark blonde hair was tousled beneath a wool cap, and his hazel eyes held a kind of quiet steadiness. He entered the classroom with careful steps, boots squeaking against the tile floor. "I got your call," he said to Grace, kneeling beside the dog. He lifted its leg carefully, examined the bruising and the crusted wound. "He's got frostbite in one paw. Infection's setting in. Could be a few days out in this cold." And he looked up. "He's not wild. Not even close." "What do you mean?" Grace asked. Lucas pointed to the shepherd's posture. "Still follows commands. Look at how he watches us, measured, alert. This dog was trained. Maybe police. Maybe military. Definitely once loved." Ben didn't speak, but his hand stayed on the dog's side the entire time. Grace asked softly, "Do you have room at the clinic?" Lucas hesitated. "We're swamped with livestock cases. Flu's going around." But he looked at Grace, then at Ben. "I could leave you a kit. You're good with animals. Keep him warm, hydrated. I'll come back tomorrow." Grace nodded. "We'll make it work." "What's his name?" Lucas asked. Grace glanced at Ben. Ben whispered, "Bruno." The dog's ears twitched at the sound, and in that moment, Grace knew Bruno had just come home. Snow continued to fall lightly over Mountain Hollow, layering rooftops and pine branches in a gentle hush. The town, already quiet by nature, seemed even more still as winter tightened its grip. Inside Willow Creek Elementary, Room 3B had become something of a sanctuary, not just for the children bundled in sweaters and boots, but for the strange new presence that now lay curled in a nest of blankets near the heater. Bruno, the wounded German shepherd, had barely moved in hours. His eyes followed movement in the room, alert but unreadable. His ears twitched when children laughed too loud, or when the school bell echoed through the hallway. But mostly he rested, head between his paws, one bandaged leg stretched out stiffly, his breathing shallow but steady. Lucas Granger arrived that morning again, just as promised. Snow clung to his boots and shoulders as he stepped into the classroom, a small vet bag slung over his arm. His expression was serious, though not unkind. "Morning, Grace," he said quietly, nodding toward the desk where she sat correcting papers. Grace Ellison stood, brushing her cardigan closed. "He hasn't eaten yet," she said. "Drank some warm water, but nothing more." Lucas knelt beside Bruno. The dog lifted his head, but didn't growl. Lucas moved gently, murmuring low reassurances as he unwrapped the gauze around the leg. The wound was deeper than he'd initially thought, a clean cut, likely from wire or glass, but surrounded by bruising and minor frostbite. Infection hadn't spread far, but it would take care. "I'll clean it again and change the dressing," he said. "He's stable. But there's something else." He reached into his bag, pulled out a small toolkit, and motioned for Grace to come closer. Gently, he lifted the fur around Bruno's neck. Tucked beneath the collarbone, almost hidden beneath the matted fur, was a tiny sliver of metal embedded in the skin, a microplate tag, dulled with age. "Military issue," Lucas murmured. "See this engraving? Numbers mostly eroded, but it's definitely K9. Possibly Army." Grace's face paled. Why would a military dog end up outside a school in Montana? Lucas shook his head. "That's the part we don't know." He removed the tag carefully, dropped it into a small evidence bag, and slipped it back into his pocket. "I have a friend who used to work in Fort Carson's K9 program. I'll send him a photo, see if anything comes up. As he rewrapped the bandage, Bruno's eyes flicked toward the door. A moment later, the classroom door creaked open. A small figure appeared in the gap. Ben Whitaker stepped in, his shoulders hunched slightly from the cold. He wore a thick navy hoodie and jeans a bit too short for his growing frame. His face was flushed from the walk across the snowy lot, but his eyes were calm, focused. He crossed the room slowly and sat cross-legged near Bruno without a word. Lucas gave a short smile and stood. "He's healing," he said to Ben, "but it'll take time. You're helping more than you know." Ben didn't answer. He just rested one hand gently on Bruno's side and began to speak. Not to Lucas, not to Grace, but directly to the dog. "There used to be a lake near my house," he said softly. "My dad built a dock. It was small, kind of wobbly, but he said that's where I'd learn to fish. I never really did." Grace watched from her desk, frozen by the suddenness of Ben's words. "I remember the morning it happened," Ben continued. "I was supposed to be at school, but I was sick. Mom was home. Dad left early. When a fire truck didn't come back, I kept thinking maybe they just got stuck somewhere. Maybe they were okay." His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. "I didn't talk after that. Not much. It didn't seem like there was anything worth saying." Bruno shifted slightly, pressing his body a little closer to the boy. Ben looked up. "But you came back from somewhere too, didn't you?" Grace's throat tightened. She stepped outside, needing a breath of air. Outside the classroom, the hallway was empty except for a janitor polishing the tile floors. At the far end stood Helen Wright, the school counselor, a woman in her early 60s. Helen was short, with thick gray curls and a soft but firm demeanor. She wore long knitted scarves year-round, and her voice often carried the tone of a lullaby until it didn't. Years of working with broken children had taught her both patience and steel. She raised a brow as Grace approached. "You all right?" Grace nodded, then didn't. Ben talked. Helen's brows lifted in surprise. "To you, to the dog." "Well," Helen said softly, "that's something." Grace looked down the hallway toward the front entrance. "I don't know what to do. This connection, it's real. But I'm not a therapist. I just teach reading." Helen gave a knowing smile. "Sometimes all healing needs is a quiet room and something warm to lean on. Doesn't always need a couch and a clipboard." Grace chuckled quietly, though her heart remained heavy. Later that afternoon, while the other children napped on bean bags and cots, Ben stayed beside Bruno. Grace pretended to sort books in the corner, but watched him closely. Ben pulled out a worn paperback from his backpack, The Incredible Journey. He opened it, ran a finger beneath the first line, and began to read aloud in a halting voice. Bruno blinked slowly, his tail thumping once. Ben smiled. Grace turned away, wiping a tear. That evening, in a small house on the edge of Mountain Hollow, Lucas sat at his desk sorting files. The metal tag from Bruno lay beside his keyboard. He typed the numbers he could still make out into an old database, but nothing came up. He sent an email to his contact at Fort Carson with a photo. As he hit send, he noticed something on the tag, etched so faintly it nearly disappeared beneath the scratched metal. It read, "Waverly 6th. Lucas frowned. Waverly was the name of the town 40 miles south, a military testing site before it shut down 2 years ago. He picked up his phone. The storm arrived fast and without apology. By mid-morning, heavy clouds swallowed the pale sun above Mountain Hollow, and flurries of snow turned to thick, blinding sheets. Roads disappeared beneath ice and whiteout, the town falling silent under the hush of accumulating powder. Trees bent under the growing weight, and even the hardy local wildlife vanished into burrows and barns. Mountain Hollow had endured snow before, but this was different. This storm clenched like a fist and refused to let go. Inside Willow Creek Elementary, the emergency protocol kicked in. Students who hadn't been picked up before noon were held in their classrooms. Teachers brought out sleeping mats, board games, and extra snacks from the emergency pantry. Generators kicked in by mid-afternoon when the power flickered out. Room 3B glowed with battery lanterns and the warmth of flickering space heaters. Grace Ellison moved among her students calmly, organizing pillows and calming nerves with the practiced ease of someone who had taught through blizzards before. She'd taken off her cardigan and tied her hair into a tighter bun, her cheeks flushed from the rising heat of a crowded room. Still, her voice remained steady, her posture sure. She knew eyes were watching, children who needed anchors when the world outside went wild. Bruno lay near the back corner of the classroom on a thick mat of towels and sleeping bags. He had been quieter than usual all morning, tail still, ears tense. Though his body remained mostly still, Grace noted the way his eyes shifted whenever the wind howled or a door slammed down the hall. It wasn't until the storm's sirens blared, low and drawn out, echoing through the hallway, that the change came. At first it was subtle. His breathing quickened, his shoulders tensed, his paws twitched. Then he let out a sharp bark, unlike any sound Grace had heard from him. A clipped, alarmed warning. He lurched to his feet, stumbled slightly on his injured leg, and growled low in his throat. The children froze. Then Bruno panicked. He ran, not toward the door, but away from the sound, toward a corner beneath the window. He crouched low, shaking visibly, eyes wide and unseeing. He snapped at the air once, as if fending off something invisible. Grace knelt beside him immediately, her voice low. "Bruno, it's okay. You're safe. It's just the siren." He didn't hear her. That was when Ben moved. The boy had been sitting by the heater reading, but now crossed the room without hesitation. He crouched in front of Bruno and, ignoring the growl that vibrated in the dog's chest, wrapped his arms gently around his neck. "It's okay," Ben whispered. "I know what it's like to be left." Bruno froze. His breathing slowed. Then he leaned into the boy's embrace and let out a sound that wasn't a whine and wasn't a growl, something between a sigh and a memory. Grace watched the scene, heart pounding. She felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred. That night, the students were settled in. Grace had pushed together desks to create makeshift sleeping quarters. A few parents had made it to the school on foot, wrapped in snow gear and desperation. Others were unreachable. The school became a strange, glowing haven in the dark. Grace sat on a beanbag chair beside the classroom windows, a heavy quilt around her shoulders. Outside, the snow fell sideways, the wind howling like a wounded thing. Ben approached her slowly, hands in his hoodie pockets. His eyes flicked toward the others, then back to her. She smiled. "Can't sleep?" He shook his head. After a long silence, he sat beside her. Bruno lay curled up just a few feet away, head resting on his good paw, his tail twitching now and then. "Was he a war dog?" Ben asked. Grace nodded slightly. "We think so. Dr. Lucas found a tag. He's still trying to learn more." Ben was quiet for a long moment. "My dad, he was a firefighter," he said suddenly. "People always said he was brave, that he ran toward danger when others ran away." Grace turned slightly, listening. "My mom was a nurse. She worked at a clinic near the highway. When that gas station exploded, they both went to help." He rubbed at a worn spot on his knee. "I was home. Sick. I remember hearing the blast from my window." A pause. They never came back. Grace didn't speak. Ben looked down. "I keep thinking maybe if I hadn't been sick, they wouldn't have gone. Or they would have waited. Or something would have been different." His voice broke on the last word. Grace reached over and gently touched his shoulder. "Ben, that wasn't your fault." He didn't answer, just looked at Bruno. "He knows what it's like," Ben said softly, "to lose someone. You can see it in his eyes." Grace nodded. "Yes, I think he does." Elsewhere in town, Dr. Lucas Granger sat by the fire in his cabin, scrolling through old files his friend at Fort Carson had sent over. Dozens of K-9 unit records had been archived after a fire destroyed part of the base's server years ago. It made identification difficult. Then he paused. One file, partially recovered, listed a unit known as Waverly 6th. The name of the handler was redacted, but the dog's name was visible, Shadow. Breed, German Shepherd. Status, MIA, missing in action. Lucas exhaled slowly and glanced at the metal tag again. Shadow. He stood and grabbed his coat. 2 days after the storm, the roads reopened, but the town was still draped in frost and quiet awe. The snow lay in heavy drifts across the sidewalks of Mountain Hollow, softening the edges of the world, as if time itself had slowed to take a breath. Icicles hung like silver daggers from the roof of Willow Creek Elementary, and the sun barely warmed the classroom windows as Monday morning arrived, glinting off the glass like frozen fire. Bruno, now more alert, though still limping, remained a gentle presence in room 3B. He moved cautiously, favoring his bandaged leg, but he no longer curled tightly into himself. He had started to eat again, cautiously at first, then with more trust. Grace noticed his ears perked when children read aloud, and once, he even wagged his tail when Ben entered the room. Lucas Granger hadn't returned empty-handed. He stepped into the classroom mid-morning, snow still clinging to the hem of his boots, his expression unreadable. Grace looked up from her desk. "You found something?" Lucas nodded. "Someone." He passed her a folder, thin and slightly crumpled from the ride. Inside was a photo, grainy but clear. A younger Bruno, then known as Shadow, sat tall beside a man in fatigues, mid-40s, sharp jaw, wide shoulders, buzzed brown hair. The man had his hand resting gently on the dog's back. The photo was dated 7 years ago in a place called Kunduz Province. His name was Reed Donovan, age 44, U.S. Army veteran, honorably discharged after an IED attack fractured his spine and forced early retirement. He had served alongside Shadow in Afghanistan for over 2 years. The file indicated Shadow had gone missing during a chaotic withdrawal from a base under attack. He was presumed killed in action, until now. Lucas explained, "I sent a sample from the tag residue and fur we cleaned off the chip site. DNA match with the military's archived registry. It's him." Grace felt her breath catch. "Does Reed know?" "I call," Lucas said. He didn't believe me at first, but then he went silent. Said he'd drive up. "When?" "Tonight, if the roads hold." That afternoon, Grace watched Ben from across the room. He sat by the reading corner, a book open in his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in several minutes. His posture was different, tense, guarded. She saw the way he kept glancing toward Bruno, whose head rested against a rolled-up blanket beneath the chalkboard. She waited until the class was out for recess before she sat beside him. "Something on your mind, Ben?" He shrugged, not looking up. She was quiet a moment. Then, Lucas found Bruno's old handler. "He's coming tonight." Ben's shoulders stiffened. "I thought you should know," she added gently. After a long silence, Ben whispered, "So, he'll take him?" Grace hesitated. "We don't know yet. But if Shadow really was his partner, he might want to." Ben's voice was small, trembling. "That means Bruno's leaving." She reached out, but he pulled away, stood quickly, and walked to the back of the classroom. He picked up his backpack. "I think I need to go home early." Grace did too. "Ben." But he had already slipped out the door. That evening, Lucas parked in front of the school just as the sun dipped below the treetops. The figure who stepped out of the black SUV was tall and lean, though age had slightly curved his back. He moved with a cautious stiffness, relying on a sturdy cane in his right hand. His coat was heavy wool, and a gray scarf hung loose around his neck. Reed Donovan had the kind of face shaped by war. Hollow cheeks, weather-creased brow, and tired blue eyes that carried too many shadows. His jaw was set in quiet restraint, and he didn't speak until Lucas extended a hand. "You're sure it's him?" Reed asked. Lucas nodded. "We're sure." Inside the school, Grace waited near the main office with Bruno, now sitting more upright but alert. The second Reed entered the hallway, Bruno's ears twitched. He didn't move yet, but he stared, rigid, unmoving. Reed took a slow step forward, then another, and another. He didn't say a word, but dropped to one knee despite the stiffness in his back. He opened a trembling hand. "Shadow." The dog's body jolted, then rose. Slowly, limping, he crossed the tile floor, sniffed the air, and stopped inches from the man's chest. Reed's hand hovered. Bruno leaned forward and placed his head against it. The man exhaled a long, broken sound. "You're alive," he whispered. "God, you made it." Outside, hidden behind the shed where they kept old sports equipment, Ben sat on the cold ground, his backpack beside him. Inside were 2 sandwiches, a flashlight, and a blanket he'd taken from the nurse's cot. He hadn't thought beyond tonight. He didn't have a map, but he couldn't let Bruno go, not again. He hadn't even heard Grace approach. She knelt beside him in the snow, arms crossed tight against the cold. "You were going to run away?" He nodded. Grace looked down at the frozen earth. "I get it." Ben glanced sideways. "No, you don't." "I do," she said softly, "because I lost someone once. And when I thought I might lose something else, I packed my car and drove away from the life I had. Thought running was easier than losing again." She didn't touch him. She just sat beside him, letting the silence fill the air between them. Ben wiped his nose with his sleeve. "I just don't want him to leave." Grace looked toward the school, where warm light spilled from the front windows. "Then come inside. See what happens." Back inside, Reed sat on the bench in room 3B, Bruno curled up beside him. His hand never left the dog's fur. Ben entered hesitantly, his eyes darting between Grace and the man. Reed looked up and gave a soft smile. "You must be Ben." Ben nodded. "He's lucky to have had you these past few weeks." Ben asked, "Are you taking him back?" Reed looked at the dog, then at the boy. "I thought I would. But he's changed. He came to you." "Not me." Bruno rested his head on Ben's foot. Reed whispered, "Maybe this is where he's meant to be now." The wind had picked up again over Mountain Hollow, whistling through bare tree branches and rattling loose shingles on the old library roof. Though the snowstorm had passed days earlier, its icy grip still clung to the sidewalks and roads, freezing every puddle and frosting every window. Winter had settled in like a silent overseer, demanding patience, resilience, and the ability to wait. Reed Donovan had decided to wait. He stayed in a modest guest room above the town's general store, a warm, wood-paneled space that smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Each morning, he made his way to Willow Creek Elementary using a pair of borrowed crutches. He had pushed himself too hard during the drive, and now his lower back throbbed like an old drum. Yet each ache faded the moment he entered room 3B and saw Bruno. No, Shadow, resting near the reading corner, his amber eyes lighting up whenever Reed appeared. But Reed hadn't made his decision. Each day he watched. Each day he saw the boy, Ben Vitoker, quiet, thoughtful, steady in his love for the dog, and broken in a way Reed recognized from the mirror. It was Thursday night when the snow began again, fine flakes falling like ashes in the wind. The town had quieted early, the street lamps glowing in milky circles through the descending veil. At the Whitaker home, a small two-bedroom house tucked at the end of Maple Hollow Road, the fireplace glowed warmly behind its iron screen. Ben sat at the window, his backpack already zipped shut beside him. His grandmother, Marjorie Whitaker, a woman in her early 70s with short white curls and weary eyes, had already gone to bed. She was kind, but distant. Grief had dulled her warmth, and while she cared deeply for her grandson, she often struggled to express it. Her silence had become habit, and Ben had long since stopped waiting for bedtime stories. Tonight, he had no plans to sleep. Bruno lay at his feet, tail thumping softly against the floor. The dog's body had regained strength in the past week, though the limp remained. He had grown used to Ben's touch, Ben's voice, Ben's stillness. Ben slipped on his boots, layered a coat over his pajamas. "Come on," he whispered. Bruno stood. Grace was just finishing her tea when the phone rang. It was past 11. Few people called that late. "Lucas." Her voice was tight with alarm before he even finished the first sentence. "Reed says Bruno's missing. So is Ben." She was already pulling on her coat. Reed stood on the school's front steps, his coat unzipped despite the chill. His face was pale, a mixture of guilt and dread. Lucas stood beside him, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the dark trees lining the playground. Grace arrived in minutes, breath puffing in clouds as she jogged up the steps. They couldn't have gone far. Reed clenched his jaw. He wouldn't hurt the boy, Shadow. But it's cold. And that forest. They're not far. Grace cut in, her voice sharper than usual. Ben wouldn't leave the town. He just wants to escape what might hurt him. Reed looked at her, surprised. "You think I'm a threat?" Grace stared back. "I think you're a good man. But that dog is no longer just a soldier. He's a lifeline, and you're not the only one he's saved." They found him 40 minutes later, in the low woods beyond the edge of town, near the frozen creek that snaked behind the logging trail, Bruno's tracks wove between trees, stopping near a hollow under a cluster of fallen branches. Grace spotted them first. Two forms curled in the moonlight, the dog lying protectively beside the boy, both covered in snow. Ben stirred as they approached, blinking groggily, the flashlight beam making him squint. "I didn't mean to get lost," he whispered. I didn't want him to leave." Reed moved slowly, his boots crunching over frozen leaves. He crouched awkwardly, one hand bracing his bad hip. "I didn't know what he meant to you," he said gently. "Not until I saw you just now." Ben looked down. "He's all I've got left." Reed swallowed hard. "He was all I had once, too. We were in a place where nothing good survived. Except him. He always ran toward the sound of trouble." He reached out, his hand resting lightly on Bruno's back. "But this time," Reed said, voice shaking, "he ran toward you." A long silence. Then Ben whispered, "Will you take him back?" Reed looked at the boy, really looked, the scar beneath the resilience. The child that grief had tried to steal. "No," he said. Ben's head jerked up. Reed smiled, the first genuine smile Grace had seen on him. He made his choice, and I think he still has more to do here. Back at the school, they warmed up with cocoa and blankets. Grace stayed beside Ben until he fell asleep on the beanbag chair beside the heater, Bruno curled tightly beside him. Reed remained near the window, one hand resting against the glass. "He's more than a dog," he said softly. Grace nodded. "He always was." The snow began to melt by the second week of December. It didn't vanish overnight. It receded slowly, cautiously, like a guest unsure if it had overstayed. The icicles that once clung to gutters dripped all day long, forming glistening puddles along the sidewalks of Mountain Hollow. The trees, once burdened with frost, now swayed in wet wind, branches cracking softly under thawing tension. And in room 3B of Willow Creek Elementary, something else had thawed, too. Something in the hearts of the people inside. Bruno, still sometimes called Shadow by Reed, though he never seemed to mind the double name, had become more than a classroom dog. He had become a presence, a rhythm, a quiet anchor. Every morning he greeted each student with a gentle nudge or a slow wag of the tail. During reading time, he lay beside Ben or nestled at the foot of whichever child needed him most that day. He no longer flinched at loud noises. He no longer slept with one eye open. And Reed Donovan, former sergeant of Waverly's 6th Division, wasn't in a rush to leave. He stood now in the back field behind the school, watching a group of 4th graders learn how to build basic shelters using fallen branches, rope, and tarps. His frame was lean but strong beneath a canvas jacket, his graying buzz cut tucked beneath a worn cap. He moved with effort. His old war injury still made his right side stiff, but his voice was clear, low, and calm. The students listened to him, not because he barked commands, but because he carried the kind of quiet authority born from survival. Grace stood a few yards away, arms crossed, her breath misting in the air. "He's good with them," she said softly. Beside her stood Marla Jennings, a middle-aged woman from the local school board. She was tall, with tightly curled salt and pepper hair and sharp cheekbones. Her fitted wool coat suggested a woman who favored practicality over softness, but her eyes were warm, observant. "I can see that," Marla replied. "Better than a few of the actual teachers." Grace chuckled. He offered to stay on until winter break. Help with outdoor classes, teach survival basics. The kids respond to him. "And the dog?" Grace smiled, glancing toward the edge of the field where Bruno lay watching the children like a sentinel. "The dog is half the reason these kids show up early now." Marla nodded. "You mentioned something about a grant?" Grace handed her a slim folder. "I've been applying for months. Trauma support programs for rural schools don't get much attention. But last week I got a call. The state is ready to fund a pilot program." Marla raised an eyebrow. "A what?" "A canine comfort center," Grace said, her voice brightening. "A place where children dealing with loss, anxiety, or PTSD can spend time with trained rescue dogs. Therapy through presence, not pressure. We'll partner with vets, trainers, and Reed's agreed to help." Marla flipped through the proposal, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up. "You're serious about this?" I am. Marla looked over at Ben, who was trying to secure a tarp under Reed's guidance. The boy's shoulders were straighter now, his face more open. He had laughed 3 times that morning. Grace had counted. All right, Marla said. I'll back it at the board meeting. Grace's breath caught. You will. With a name like the Canine Comfort Program and a poster of that dog. Who could say no? Later that afternoon, Reed sat alone in the staff break room, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. The window beside him overlooked the playground, where muddy slush now streaked across the blacktop. Grace entered, brushing snow from her scarf. You settling in? She asked, pulling up a chair. He nodded. More than I thought I would. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Ben's changed, Reed said finally. Since everything. Grace smiled. He's beginning to believe in tomorrow again. And Shadow. Reed looked down at his cup. He was mine once. I trained him, fought beside him. He saved my life more than once. Grace waited, but I think his real mission started when he found that boy. She reached across the table, placing a hand over his. He came home, just not the home you expected. In the weeks that followed, the school transformed. Old storage rooms were cleared. Rugs were rolled out. Shelves filled with dog food, blankets, and donated books. A faded banner, painted by the students, hung above the classroom door. Healing happens here. Word spread. A few parents asked to volunteer. A retired dog trainer from Bozeman offered to visit weekly. Local vets donated supplies. The program hadn't even officially launched, yet already had a heartbeat. And at the center of it was Bruno, Shadow, a scarred, once-lost soldier who had chosen to stay. Sometimes, the ones who heal us don't speak our language. They just sit quietly beside us until the pain softens. Shadow didn't return for medals or memories. He returned for a broken boy who needed a friend more than the world knew. And in doing so, he reminded us that second chances don't always come loud. They arrive in silence, with muddy paws and unwavering eyes. In our own lives, we may carry scars no one sees. But healing often begins with connection, with patience, presence, and the courage to stay. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and let us know what part moved you most. Type them in if you believe that love can find its way back, even through snow, sorrow, or time. And don't forget to subscribe. Stories like these are meant to be felt and remembered. May God bless you and the ones you love.